The aliens had run this experiment 47 times. Every single human died. Every time, without exception. They had the data, they had the models, they had centuries of human behavior analyzed down to the last panic decision. They knew exactly what we would do when the air ran out and the door started scratching. They knew because we always did the same thing. We always died the same way. But this time they made one mistake. They let a man who read too much get locked in a room with 6 hours of oxygen and nothing to lose. Room smelled like copper and old concrete, and somewhere behind the sealed door something was scratching. Not knocking. Scratching. The patient, methodical scrape of fingernails worn down to bone. Arthur pressed his back against the far wall and did not look at the door. He looked at Letitia instead, which was its own kind of problem. She was crouched over the tactical display they'd pulled from the wreckage of the entry pod, a flat slab of flickering alien glass that none of them had been trained to read, and her jaw was set in the way it got when she was solving something she hadn't admitted yet was unsolvable. 3 years they'd worked together before the Varathi took the station. 3 years, and he still couldn't tell the difference between her thinking face and her giving-up face. He hoped it was the thinking one. "How many?" Benjamin asked. He was by the window, sealed, of course. Everything was sealed, pressing his cheek to the composite frame like he could hear through it by willpower alone. "At least 40 on this level," Letitia said. She didn't look up. "The signal keeps fragmenting. Could be more." "Could be more," Benjamin repeated, as though the words tasted bad. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, the kind of build that made aliens underestimate how quickly he could think. The Varathi had made that mistake twice already today. There wouldn't be a third time. How much air? 6 hours, maybe 7 if we stop talking. "We won't stop talking." "No," she agreed, "we won't." Arthur pulled himself off the wall. The room was maybe 8 meters by 12, a processing bay on the outer ring of what had been a human research outpost before the Varathi classified it as a Level 1 containment zone, which was their word for a place where the things they'd released were allowed to run. He'd learned that from the mission briefing. He wished he hadn't. The things the Varathi released in their containment zones weren't the Varathi themselves. They were older specimens, harvested from other worlds, kept in biological stasis, and then activated as a kind of live perimeter. The creatures outside the door weren't alien. They'd been human once. The briefing had been very specific about that. He picked up the section of conduit pipe he'd been using as a weapon and turned it over in his hands. It wasn't much. None of this was much. "The ventilation," he said. Letitia looked up. "What about it?" "The shafts connect to the exterior maintenance crawlways. The Varathi sealed the doors, but they won't have sealed the vents. They don't breathe the same way we do. The geometry of an air system built for human lungs is a dead spot in their threat modeling." "A dead spot," Benjamin said slowly. "You're telling me you want to crawl through a vent shaft?" "I'm telling you the vent shaft is the only exit that doesn't require us to go through 40 of those things." Silence. The scratching at the door had changed rhythm, become more urgent, as if whatever was outside had sensed the conversation through the walls. Arthur had stopped being surprised by that. The Varatha's biological constructs didn't have language, but they had something like attention, a distributed awareness that oriented toward sound and warmth and the particular electromagnetic signature of human nervous systems under stress. The more afraid you were, the more precisely they knew where you were. He tried to be less afraid. It didn't work. "The shafts are 40 centimeters wide," Letitia said. "I measured them when we first arrived." "I know. You're not 40 centimeters wide." "I know that too." She almost smiled. Almost. It vanished before it fully formed, swallowed back by whatever was running cold calculations behind her eyes. "The maintenance crawlway lets out on the exterior loading platform. The Varathi atmospheric processors are running. We'd be outside in an alien atmosphere for approximately 4 minutes before we reach the emergency shelter on the platform's far end." How long can we hold our breath? Normally, 3 minutes. Then we'll need to not do it normally. He moved to the ventilation panel and began working the screws with the edge of the conduit pipe, feeling them bite and slip and bite again. There's a technique, shallow breath cycling, slow your heart rate, oxygenate before you go. Free divers used to do it on Earth. Deep water, no tanks. I read about it once. You read about it, Benjamin said flatly. I read a lot. Arthur. Benjamin crossed the room in 4 strides and put a hand on his shoulder, not stopping him, just making him pause. When Arthur turned, the big man's face was serious in a way that bypassed his usual performance of calm. If this goes wrong, then we're in the same position we're in if we stay here, except we'll have tried. He held Benjamin's gaze. That's something, isn't it, that we tried? Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and stepped back. The vent panel came off in Arthur's hands, with a sound like a small defeat. The shaft was dark and it smelled like recycled nothing, the particular emptiness of air that had been processed so many times it had forgotten what planet it came from. Arthur went first because it had been his idea, and because some internal arithmetic he couldn't quite name made that feel correct. He moved on his forearms and knees with the conduit pipe slung across his back, keeping his breathing shallow the way he'd explained to the others, though in practice it felt less like a technique and more like controlled panic. Behind him he could hear Letitia. Behind her, Benjamin, who was making the shaft flex slightly with every movement of his shoulders. Arthur did not think about what happened if the shaft gave way. He thought about the loading platform. He thought about the emergency shelter. He thought about the very specific and concrete sequence of actions that would carry them from here to there, and he thought about nothing else. The Varathi had built this station's containment architecture based on a precise model of human threat behavior. They'd run projections. They'd analyzed 3 centuries of human conflict data captured from monitored deep space transmissions and concluded that in enclosed environments with limited exits, human groups under biological threat pressure would default to one of 7 defensive configurations, and they had designed the Level 1 zone to foreclose all 7. They had not modeled free diving. This is what Arthur thought about, moving through the dark. The Varathi were very good at predicting what humans did when they were afraid. They were not as good at predicting what humans did when they were afraid, and had also, at some point in their brief strange history, decided that the ocean floor was somewhere worth visiting for fun. The shaft turned again. Then it became colder noticeably. Suddenly, the temperature dropped that meant they were approaching the exterior interface. Arthur stopped, pressed himself flat and breathed. Deep and slow, 4 counts in, hold, 6 counts out. He felt his pulse slow fractionally. He felt his hands stop shaking fractionally. He thought about the free divers in the article he'd read, the way they described the descent as a form of letting go rather than a form of struggle, how the body became cooperative when you stopped fighting it. He thought about Letitia behind him in the dark, running the same calculations she always ran. He thought about Benjamin, who had put a hand on his shoulder and nodded, which was more or less what passed for a speech with Benjamin. He pushed through the exterior grate. The alien atmosphere hit him like cold fire, thin and sharp, carrying trace compounds that weren't toxic but weren't kind, the kind of air that reminded your lungs they were borrowed equipment on a borrowed world. He moved without stopping, because stopping would have been the worst thing. Moved across the loading platform with the stars wheeling overhead in configurations that still didn't look right to him after 14 months in this system, and he counted seconds in the part of his mind that wasn't busy being terrified. Behind him he heard Letitia emerge, then Benjamin, and the distinctive grunt of a large man who'd had to dislocate his own shoulder to fit through an access grate and wasn't going to make a big deal about it. 1 minute. The platform was maybe 30 meters end to end, and the emergency shelter sat at the far edge. a squat pressurized cube that the Varathi had never bothered to disable because they'd never believed any occupant of a level 1 zone would reach it. Arthur ran. He didn't look at the sky. He didn't look back. He ran the way he'd learned to run on a ship with low gravity and tight corridors, not fast, not slow, efficient, each stride measured and placed. 2 minutes. His vision was beginning to blur at the edges, not from lack of air but from the atmospheric compounds. He blinked it away. The shelter door had a manual override, they all did, human standard across every outpost, because some engineer somewhere had won an argument about redundancy, and his hands found it by feel. 2 minutes 40. The door opened. They fell through it in approximately that order, Arthur, Letitia, Benjamin pulling the door shut behind him with a sound like finality, and then there was pressure and warmth and breathable air, and for a long moment none of them did anything but exist in it. Benjamin was holding his dislocated shoulder with his other hand. He was also grinning. It was an unnerving combination. "You read about free diving," he said. "I read a lot," Arthur said again from the floor. Letitia pulled herself upright against the shelter wall and looked at the both of them, Arthur horizontal, Benjamin grinning like a broken mechanism. And then she did something Arthur had only seen her do a handful of times. She laughed. Not the polite version she used in meetings, the small, carefully constructed sound that kept professional distance intact. The real one, the one that started somewhere below language. It lasted about 4 seconds, and it changed something in the room's atmosphere more thoroughly than the pressurization system had. "The Varathi databanks," she said when she'd recovered. "They'll have a network node somewhere on this level, if we can reach it." "We can pull the architectural schematics," Arthur said. He was sitting up now. "Map the other containment zones. Map them and flag them for extraction teams." She looked at him steadily. "There are other people in there, Arthur, in the other levels, other rooms like ours." He knew. He'd been not thinking about it since the mission briefing, holding it at a particular arm's length, because thinking about it in the room with the scratching door and 6 hours of air had not been useful. It was useful now. "Then we keep moving," he said. The shelter had emergency rations, a short-range communicator with a signal that would take 11 hours to reach the nearest relay, and one pressurized environment suit in size medium. They divided the rations 3 ways. Arthur put on the suit because he was closest to medium and because someone had to go back out. Before he sealed the helmet, Letitia put a hand on his arm, not to stop him, just to make contact. "The Varathi built this as a demonstration," she said. "That's what the briefing said. A level 1 zone is the simplest configuration, the easiest to contain, the most likely to result in termination before the 72-hour mark. It's meant to demonstrate inevitability." "I know. They've run it 47 times across occupied stations, 47 level 1s. Her hand didn't move. "No one's reached this shelter before." He looked at her for a moment, at the jaw set in its particular way, at the calculation running behind her eyes, at the fact that she was still here, still thinking, still planning 4 moves ahead in a game she had no reason to believe she could win. 48, he said, and sealed the helmet. The node was in the station's secondary maintenance hub, 3 corridors from the shelter, and he reached it in 11 minutes and 30 seconds by moving through maintenance crawlways that were marginally wider than the ventilation shafts, and avoiding 2 of the Varathi's biological constructs that had wandered from the containment zone through a sealed door that was no longer as sealed as it had been. The Varathi's network security was sophisticated. It was also built on the assumption that any human attempting to breach it would be desperate, panicked, and working under conditions of cognitive impairment from stress and biological threat exposure. This was usually correct. Arthur had been desperate and panicked, but he'd also been reading, in the long dead hours between shifts, in the particular kind of boredom that comes from knowing something terrible is probably coming and being unable to do anything but wait. and he'd read extensively about the Varathi network architecture, which was a matter of public record, because the Varathi had never believed human beings were interesting enough to constitute a threat worth concealing information from. He pulled the schematics. 14 other occupied containment zones in this station cluster. 14 rooms like theirs, in various stages of what the Varathi data logs clinically described as conclusion. He flagged all of them with the communicator's emergency burst signal, an 11-hour delay before it reached the relay, another 6 before extraction teams could mobilize. But it was a coordinate, it was a marker, it was the difference between invisible and findable. Then he looked at the Varathi command structure displayed in the network map, the tidy hierarchy of the thing, how it all flowed up to a single atmospheric regulation node that controlled the pressurization of the entire station cluster. And he sat with that information for about 30 seconds. He thought about 47 level ones, about the scratching at the door, about the way the mission briefing had described inevitability as a feature rather than a flaw. He made a decision that was not in the mission parameters, and that he would have to explain at considerable length to several people who outranked him, assuming there were eventually people who outranked him to explain it to. He crashed the atmospheric regulation node for the containment zones only, and flushed them with oxygen-nitrogen mix at 3 times standard pressure, enough to disorient the Varathi's biological constructs, which had evolved for thinner air, without harming the humans in the rooms. 14 rooms, 1 command input. He pressed it the way you press something when you know it's the right thing and you're still not entirely sure you're not about to make everything worse, which is the way humans press most of the things that matter. Then he started back toward the shelter. The communicator reply came 53 minutes later, not 11 hours. A relay team had been closer than the mission parameters assumed, monitoring the station cluster, waiting for exactly this kind of signal. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and spoke in the flat cadence of someone trying to contain considerable surprise. "We're reading your signal and 14 secondary signals from the cluster. Can you confirm survivor count at your position?" Arthur looked at Letitia, looked at Benjamin, who had reset his own shoulder and was eating rations with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided not to dramatize any of the last 3 hours. 3 at our position, he said, and counting. The extraction team arrived at hour 9. They came in hard, burning through the Varathi perimeter with a kind of organized aggression that suggested whoever had authorized the mission had decided something had shifted in the calculus. Arthur stood on the loading platform in the environment suit and watched the ships come in, and thought that they looked like the best thing he'd ever seen, which was not a high bar given the day he'd had, but still felt true. The Varathi had run the level 1 scenario 48 times now. 47 had demonstrated inevitability. The 48th had demonstrated something else, something the Varathi's predictive models didn't have a clean category for. Not heroism exactly, or at least not the declared kind. More like the quality of a species that had decided, a very long time ago, that the ocean floor was worth visiting, that the dark inside ventilation shafts was navigable, that 11 hours was a reasonable lead time, that one person could crash one node and reset the arithmetic of a scenario that had been designed to end one way. The mission debrief would call it adaptability. Arthur, sitting in the back of the extraction ship with his helmet off and Letitia's shoulder against his and Benjamin already asleep across both their laps, thought the word was too clean, too contained. The thing they had done didn't fit in a word. It fit in the space between a hand on an arm and a sealed helmet, in the time it takes a jaw to set and a decision to form, in the gap between what a species is predicted to do and what it actually does when the door is scratching and the air is thin and the odds have already been run. He had read about free diving once. He was glad he had. He was glad he read things. He looked out the window at the station cluster receding behind them at the lights coming on in 14 formerly dark rooms as extraction teams moved through them, and he thought, 47. 47 times before anyone made it out. He was going to read that number differently for the rest of his life.